Marcus Blackwell adjusted his Italian silk tie as he stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse office. At 34, he commanded one of the largest tech corporations in the world, his every decision affecting thousands of employees and millions of shareholders. Power was his currency, control his religion. The intercom buzzed softly. His assistant's voice filtered through the speaker with practiced discretion. The escort service had confirmed his appointment for 8 p.m. Marcus had specific requirements: intelligent, sophisticated, someone who could accompany him to the charity gala without embarrassing him. He needed arm candy that could hold a conversation with senators and CEOs alike. He had heard whispers about Elena Vasquez through his exclusive circles: refined, educated, expensive. The kind of woman who understood discretion and the unspoken rules of his world. What he hadn't expected was someone who might challenge every assumption he held about strength and weakness. The evening stretched ahead of him like a carefully orchestrated performance. He would arrive at the gala with a stunning companion, network with the city's elite, make his substantial donation for the tax benefits and positive press, then return home. Simple, controlled, predictable. Marcus prided himself on reading people instantly, their motivations, their weaknesses, their price. Everyone had one. In his experience, those in Elena's profession were particularly easy to categorize: desperate, damaged, lacking the courage to pursue legitimate careers. He expected tonight to unfold exactly as all his arrangements did: professional, detached, forgettable. The city lights began to flicker on below as darkness settled over Manhattan. Marcus straightened his shoulders, mentally preparing for another evening of maintaining his carefully constructed image. He had no idea that within hours, every certainty in his ordered world would begin to crumble. The lobby of the St. Regis Hotel hummed with understated luxury as Marcus waited, checking his platinum Patek Philippe watch. Elena Vasquez emerged from the elevator precisely on time, and his breath caught involuntarily. She moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in her own skin, her midnight blue evening gown elegant without being ostentatious. Her dark hair was swept into a sophisticated chignon, revealing the graceful line of her neck, but it was her eyes that gave him pause, intelligent, assessing, utterly fearless as they met his gaze. She extended a gloved hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. "Mr. Blackwell, I presume." Her voice carried a slight accent he couldn't place, cultured and warm. "Elena Vasquez. I trust the evening will meet your expectations." Marcus found himself momentarily off balance. He'd expected deference, perhaps nervous energy, the subtle signs of someone grateful for his patronage. Instead, Elena regarded him with the calm assessment of an equal. Her handshake was firm, brief, professional. As they settled into the back of his Bentley, Marcus studied her profile in the passing streetlights. She seemed genuinely interested in the cityscape, occasionally commenting on architectural details with surprising knowledge. When he mentioned the evening's guest list, she demonstrated familiarity with current events and international politics that exceeded his expectations. "You're well informed," he observed, testing. "I find ignorance expensive," she replied simply, adjusting her silk wrap, "particularly in circumstances that require adaptability." The comment carried layers he couldn't quite pass. Marcus was accustomed to people either fawning over his wealth and power or barely concealing their intimidation. Elena's composed indifference was entirely new territory. She seemed neither impressed by his status nor diminished by it. By the time they arrived at the gala, Marcus realized his evening might prove more interesting than anticipated. The Metropolitan Museum's Great Hall glittered with New York's social elite. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over designer gowns and tailored tuxedos as guests mingled among priceless artifacts. Marcus moved through the crowd with Elena at his side, noting how naturally she navigated the social dynamics. When Senator Richardson approached with his wife, Marcus tensed slightly, prepared to steer the conversation away from potentially awkward questions about Elena's background. Instead, she engaged effortlessly in discussion about recent legislation affecting arts funding, demonstrating knowledge that impressed even the senator. "Your companion is remarkably well-versed," Richardson murmured to Marcus during a brief private moment. "Where did you find such a gem?" Marcus watched Elena across the room, now in animated conversation with the museum's board chair about Renaissance sculpture techniques. Her laugh was genuine, unforced, and several heads turned appreciatively in her direction. She belonged here in ways that surprised him. Throughout dinner, Elena proved the perfect companion, charming without being effusive, knowledgeable without being pretentious. She listened more than she spoke, asking thoughtful questions that made others feel interesting. Marcus found himself genuinely enjoying her company rather than simply appreciating her utility. During the auction portion of the evening, Elena remained quietly attentive as Marcus bid on several pieces. When a 19th century first edition of Emily Dickinson's poems came up, he noticed her subtle intake of breath, the slight forward lean that indicated genuine interest. "Beautiful piece," she murmured, "just for him." Marcus raised his paddle, ultimately winning the lot for considerably more than he had planned to spend. Elena's surprised smile felt like an unexpected gift. For the first time in years, his impulse purchase had nothing to do with investment potential or social positioning. As the evening wound down, Marcus realized he had spent hours without checking his phone once, a near impossibility in his usual routine. The ride back to Elena's hotel passed in comfortable quiet, the city's neon reflections painting shifting patterns across the Bentley's interior. Marcus found himself reluctant for the evening to end, though he couldn't articulate why. Professional arrangements typically concluded efficiently, without lingering or unnecessary conversation. "Thank you for tonight," Eleanor said as the car pulled to a stop. "It was unexpectedly pleasant." Something in her tone suggested she too had been surprised by the evening's trajectory. Marcus studied her face in the dim light, searching for the practiced pleasantries he expected from someone in her position. Instead, he found what appeared to be genuine appreciation. "Perhaps we could arrange something again," he heard himself saying, the words emerging without his usual calculation. Elena's pause lasted only a moment, but Marcus caught the flicker of something. Consideration? Wariness? He couldn't read her expression as clearly as he read most people, and the uncertainty bothered him. "My schedule is quite demanding," she replied carefully. "But I'm sure something could be arranged through the usual channels." The formal distance in her response stung more than it should have. Marcus was accustomed to people eagerly seeking his continued attention, his approval, his money. Elena's polite deflection felt like a door closing just as he realized he wanted it to remain open. She moved to exit the car, then paused. "The Dickinson collection was a generous gesture. I hope you'll enjoy it." After she disappeared into the hotel lobby, Marcus sat in the back of his car longer than necessary, replaying moments from the evening. Eleanor's laugh during dinner, the way she had touched his arm briefly while making a point about sustainable development, her genuine interest when he mentioned his company's education initiatives. For the first time in memory, he had spent an evening with someone who seemed to see past his wealth and position to something more fundamental. The realization both thrilled and unsettled him in ways he couldn't yet understand. Marcus spent the following week attempting to focus on quarterly reports and merger negotiations, but his thoughts kept returning to Elena Vasquez. He told himself his interest was purely intellectual. She was an anomaly in his ordered world, a puzzle to be solved. Nothing more. Finally, he instructed his head of security to compile a discreet background report. Marcus told himself it was standard procedure, due diligence for someone entering his social circle. The file that landed on his desk 3 days later challenged every assumption he had made. Elena Vasquez held a PhD in international relations from Columbia University. She had worked for the State Department for 5 years, specializing in economic development policy for emerging markets. Her academic credentials were impeccable, her professional recommendations glowing. She spoke 4 languages fluently and had published papers on sustainable development that were cited by major international organizations. The report raised more questions than it answered. Someone with Elena's qualifications and background should be running NGOs or consulting for Fortune 500 companies, not working for an escort service. The disconnect between her obvious capabilities and her current profession gnawed at Marcus throughout the day. He found himself crafting and deleting text messages, starting and abandoning emails. His usual directness felt inappropriate somehow. Elena had made it clear that further contact should go through official channels, but Marcus wanted to understand the woman behind the careful professional facade. That evening, instead of staying late at the office as usual, Marcus found himself walking through Central Park. The Dickinson First Edition sat unopened on his coffee table at home, a beautiful reminder of an evening that felt increasingly significant. He had bought it impulsively, moved by Elena's obvious appreciation for literature, without considering whether the gesture might be misinterpreted. The autumn air was crisp, carrying hints of the approaching winter. Marcus rarely took time to notice seasonal changes, but something about his encounter with Elena had sharpened his awareness of details he typically overlooked. He was becoming someone he didn't entirely recognize. More observant, less certain, oddly vulnerable. The realization both frightened and intrigued him. 2 weeks passed before Marcus finally picked up the phone to call the escort service. He had rehearsed what he would say, how he would frame his request as purely professional. Another social obligation requiring an appropriate companion. Nothing more complicated than a business transaction. The familiar voice of the service coordinator was professionally warm. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell. Miss Vasquez did mention you might call again. She's available next Friday evening if that works for your schedule." Marcus felt an unexpected flutter of relief that Eleanor had anticipated his contact, had even prepared for it. Perhaps their evening together had affected her as well, though he tried not to read too much into the coordinator's neutral tone. "Actually, I had something different in mind," Marcus said, abandoning his prepared script. "Not a social event. I'd like to take her to dinner, somewhere quiet where we can talk." The pause on the other end lasted several beats too long. "I'll need to confirm that arrangement with Miss Vasquez. She's quite selective about intimate settings." Marcus almost laughed at the misunderstanding. In his world, intimate meant closed-door business meetings and private jets. He hadn't considered how his request might be interpreted by someone in Elena's profession. "Nothing inappropriate," he clarified quickly. "I simply prefer conversation without the distractions of a crowd. There's a restaurant I know, public, respectable. I give you my word that my intentions are entirely honorable." 24 hours later, the coordinator called back with Elena's acceptance and the name of a restaurant Marcus hadn't suggested, Le Bernardin, one of the city's most exclusive establishments. The choice intrigued him. Elena was clearly comfortable in high-end environments, but her selection suggested she wanted to maintain control over their meeting's parameters. As Friday approached, Marcus found himself uncharacteristically anxious about the evening ahead. He had conquered boardrooms full of hostile executives, negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, but the prospect of dinner alone with Elena felt like stepping into uncharted territory. He arrived at the restaurant early, something he never did, and requested a corner table with privacy. Elena arrived wearing a simple black dress that somehow managed to be both understated and elegant. She had chosen her attire carefully, Marcus realized, sophisticated enough for the venue, modest enough to avoid sending mixed signals about the evening's nature. Even her greeting was perfectly calibrated, warm but professional, friendly but not intimate. "This is lovely," she said, settling into her chair and glancing around the restaurant's refined interior. "I haven't been here in years." The comment implied a familiarity with fine dining that aligned with the background report Marcus had commissioned. As they studied their menus and discussed wine selections, Elena demonstrated the kind of culinary knowledge that came from genuine experience, not research. "You seem very comfortable in environments like this," Marcus observed as their appetizers arrived. Elena's smile carried a hint of amusement. "Should that surprise you?" "Perhaps it shouldn't," he admitted. "Though I confess to being curious about your career path. You're clearly well-educated, sophisticated. I imagine you have options most people in your profession don't." The directness of his comment hung between them for a moment. Elena set down her fork and regarded him steadily, as if deciding how much truth to reveal. "Everyone makes choices based on their circumstances," she said finally. "Sometimes the most logical path isn't immediately obvious to outside observers." Her deflection was skilled but not dismissive. Marcus sensed he was approaching boundaries she wasn't ready to cross, at least not yet. Instead of pressing, he shifted the conversation to safer topics: books, travel, current events. Elena's responses revealed a sharp intellect and global perspective that captivated him. Halfway through their main course, Elena surprised him with a question of her own. "What made you decide to contact me again? And please don't say you needed another companion for a social event. We both know this isn't that kind of evening." Her directness caught Marcus off guard. He was accustomed to people carefully avoiding topics that might make him uncomfortable, dancing around questions that probed too deeply into his motivations or feelings. Marcus found himself studying Elena's face in the restaurant's soft lighting, searching for the right words. Her question demanded honesty, but vulnerability had never been his strong suit. In business, showing uncertainty was often tantamount to showing weakness. "I found our last evening refreshing," he said carefully. "It's rare that I meet someone who seems genuinely unimpressed by the usual things that impress people." Elena's laugh was soft but knowing. "You mean your wealth and power?" "Among other things." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed by how transparent his admission sounded. "I realize how that must sound coming from someone in my position." "It sounds honest," Elena replied, surprising him. "Most people in your circumstances surround themselves with those who reinforce their self-importance. Seeking out someone who can't be comfortable." Her observation was more perceptive than flattering, and Marcus found himself appreciating the difference. Elena wasn't telling him what he wanted to hear. She was telling him what she observed. The distinction felt significant. "May I ask you something?" Marcus said, emboldened by her candor. Elena nodded, though he noticed her posture straighten slightly. "The background check I ran suggested someone with your qualifications should be running international development programs, not this. I'm not judging your choices, but I am curious about them." For a long moment, Elena said nothing. Marcus watched emotions flicker across her features: calculation, resignation, perhaps a touch of relief. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weariness that hadn't been there before. 3 years ago, I was working for the State Department on a development project in Central America. I discovered that funds meant for clean water infrastructure were being diverted to weapons purchases. When I reported it, I was told to focus on my assigned duties and stop asking questions. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. He had heard similar stories throughout his career, though usually from the perspective of those covering up inconvenient truths. When I persisted, I was reassigned to increasingly meaningless positions until I finally resigned. My former supervisor made sure I was effectively blacklisted from similar positions elsewhere. Elena's revelation hung between them as their server refilled wine glasses and discreetly retreated. Marcus found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about courage and cowardice, strength and weakness. The woman sitting across from him had risked her career for principles most people only claim to hold. "So you went from trying to save lives to—" Marcus let the sentence trail off, uncertain how to finish without seeming judgmental. "To a profession that pays well and asks no questions about my previous employment," Elena completed matter-of-factly. "It's temporary, Marcus. I'm saving money and waiting for the right opportunity to rebuild my career, probably in the private sector where my reputation matters less than my results." Her use of his first name felt intimate despite the clinical way she discussed her circumstances. Marcus realized she was trusting him with information that could likely damage her current income source if mishandled. "That took courage," he said quietly. "What you did at the State Department." Elena's smile was rueful. "It took naivety. Courage would have been finding a smarter way to handle the situation. Instead, I destroyed my career and probably changed nothing about the corruption I was trying to expose." "But you tried. Most people wouldn't have. Most people wouldn't have needed to. They would have been smart enough to look the other way and protect their own interests." The bitterness in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus recognized the tone of someone who had learned painful lessons about the gap between idealism and reality. He had heard it in his own voice during his early business years, before cynicism had calcified into protective armor. "I used to think people in your current profession lacked options," Marcus admitted. "I assumed desperation or poor judgment led to such choices. I was wrong." Elena regarded him thoughtfully. "What changed your mind?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "You did. You're clearly capable of anything you choose to pursue. The fact that you're choosing this temporarily suggests circumstances I hadn't considered." For the first time that evening, Elena's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing something more vulnerable underneath. The remainder of their dinner passed with a new quality of openness that surprised both of them. Elena shared carefully chosen details about her previous work, projects she had been passionate about, colleagues she had respected, the satisfaction of seeing development programs actually improve people's lives. Marcus found himself sharing stories from his early business days before success had insulated him from the consequences of his decisions. "Do you miss it?" Marcus asked as they waited for dessert. "The international development work?" "Every day," Elena replied without hesitation. "But missing something and being able to return to it are different things. I've accepted that my career took a permanent detour. What if it didn't have to be permanent?" Elena's expression sharpened with interest and caution. "What do you mean?" Marcus felt himself approaching a decision he hadn't consciously made until that moment. "My company has a corporate social responsibility division that's been underperforming for years. We throw money at various causes but lack strategic direction. Someone with your background could potentially transform it into something meaningful." The offer emerged from impulses Marcus didn't entirely understand. Part business calculation, part genuine desire to help Elena return to work she found fulfilling, but also something else, a need to be seen as more than just another wealthy man purchasing temporary companionship. Elena's silence stretched long enough to make Marcus wonder if he had overstepped. Her expression was unreadable, cycling through what appeared to be surprise, consideration, and skepticism. "That's a generous thought," she said finally. "But we both know the complications that would create. Your board, shareholders, employees, they would ask questions about how you discovered someone with my qualifications. The answers wouldn't reflect well on either of us. Marcus hadn't considered the practical obstacles, though Eleanor was right to raise them. His impulse to help had outpaced his strategic thinking, an unusual reversal of his normal decision-making process. There might be ways around those complications, he said, though even as he spoke, he realized he was trying to solve a problem Elena hadn't asked him to solve. Perhaps, Elena agreed diplomatically, though I suspect you're underestimating the challenges involved. As they left the restaurant, Marcus found himself reluctant to end the evening. The conversation had shifted something fundamental in how he viewed Elena, and he suspected she saw him differently as well. The carefully maintained boundaries of their professional arrangement felt increasingly artificial. "Would you like to walk for a bit?" Marcus asked as his driver waited by the Bentley. "The night's pleasant, and I find myself not quite ready for it to end." Elena hesitated, and Marcus could see her weighing the implications of extending their time together outside the structured environment of dinner. After a moment, she nodded. Central Park at night held a different energy than during the day. Quieter, more intimate, with pools of lamplight creating islands of warmth in the darkness. They walked slowly along the paths, their conversation meandering between serious topics and lighter observations about the city around them. "Can I ask you something that might be too personal?" Eleanor said as they paused near the reservoir. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Of course. Why are you still single? Someone in your position must have numerous opportunities for relationships that don't require professional arrangements." The question was more complex than it appeared, touching on assumptions about his personal life that Marcus rarely examined directly. He considered deflecting with humor or generalities, but Elena's honesty during dinner seemed to demand reciprocal candor. "I suppose I've never met someone who seemed interested in me rather than what I could provide them," he said finally. "Wealth attracts attention, but it also creates distance. People either want something from me or feel intimidated by what they perceive as my success. And you don't think those dynamics might exist in professional arrangements as well?" Marcus stopped walking, struck by the insight. "You're suggesting that paying for companionship might create the same barriers I'm trying to avoid." "I'm suggesting that authentic connection requires equal footing," Elena replied gently, "which is difficult to achieve when one person is explicitly dependent on the other's financial support." The observation stung because it rang true. Marcus had been attracted to Elena partly because she seemed unimpressed by his status, but their entire relationship was built on financial transaction. How could he trust that her interest was genuine when she was literally paid to provide it? The question Elena had raised haunted Marcus for the next several days. He found himself analyzing every interaction they had shared, looking for signs of genuine connection versus professional performance. The uncertainty was maddening for someone accustomed to clear metrics and definitive outcomes. Finally, he called Elena directly, not through the service, but on the personal number she had given him for scheduling purposes. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying a note of surprise. "Marcus, is everything all right? I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." The words came out more urgently than he had intended. "When we've spent time together, have you felt any genuine connection, or has it all been professional performance?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Marcus began to worry the call had dropped. When Elena finally spoke, her voice was quieter than usual. "That's not a fair question to ask someone in my position." "Why not?" "Because my livelihood depends on making clients feel special, valued, connected." "How could you trust any answer I give?" Marcus felt frustration building in his chest. "So there's no way to know what's real between us?" There might be, Elena said after another pause, but it would require changing the nature of our arrangement entirely. How? By removing the financial component, by spending time together as equals without the safety net of professional boundaries, by risking genuine rejection instead of guaranteed acceptance. The proposition was both terrifying and exhilarating. Marcus had built his adult life around controlled outcomes, measured risks, guaranteed returns. The idea of pursuing Elena without the security of their business arrangement felt like stepping off a cliff. And if I agreed to that, Marcus said carefully, what would happen to your income? I can't ask you to sacrifice your financial security for an uncertain emotional experiment. Elena's laugh was soft but tinged with sadness. You see, even when you're trying to escape the dynamic, you're still thinking about what you can provide for me. Real equality means I take responsibility for my own choices and their consequences. Marcus found himself at a crossroads he hadn't anticipated when he first contacted the escort service. What had begun as a simple transaction had evolved into something far more complex and potentially transformative. Marcus spent a sleepless night wrestling with Elena's proposition. His rational mind catalogued all the risks, potential scandal if their previous arrangement became public knowledge, the uncertainty of pursuing someone whose feelings might never extend beyond professional courtesy, the disruption to his carefully ordered life. But another part of him, a part that had been dormant for years, was drawn to the possibility of something real, something that couldn't be bought or controlled or guaranteed. For the first time in his adult life, he was contemplating a decision based purely on emotional impulse rather than strategic calculation. The next morning, Marcus found himself standing outside Elena's apartment building. Having looked up her address in the background report, he now regretted commissioning. He hadn't called ahead, hadn't planned what he would say. He simply knew he needed to see her. When Elena opened her door, her surprise was evident. She was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Without makeup and evening wear, she looked younger, more approachable, but no less striking. Marcus, how did you... She stopped herself, understanding dawning in her expression. The background check. I'm sorry, I should have called, should have asked permission to come here. Elena stepped back to let him into her apartment, a tastefully furnished space filled with books, plants, and artwork that reflected her travels and interests. Marcus noticed framed photographs from what appeared to be her State Department days, images of her working in various international locations, surrounded by colleagues and local communities. I've been thinking about what you said, Marcus began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the inadequacy of words to capture what he was feeling. About changing the nature of our arrangement. Elena settled onto her sofa, gesturing for him to take the chair across from her. And? I want to try. Not because I'm certain about the outcome, but because the alternative, continuing to wonder what might be real between us, feels worse than the risk of finding out it's nothing. Eleanor studied his face for a long moment. You understand what that means? No more professional boundaries to protect us if things become complicated or uncomfortable. Marcus nodded, though he suspected he couldn't fully understand the implications until he experienced them. It means I stop accepting payment for time spent with you, effective immediately. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the same spot where he had first waited for Eleanor at the St. Regis Hotel, but everything about the circumstances had changed. Tonight, he wasn't hiring a companion for a business function. He was picking up Elena for the opening night of a new exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum, an exhibit her expertise had helped curate. The job offer Marcus had mentioned during their dinner had materialized in an unexpected way. Rather than joining his company's CSR division, Elena had been hired by the museum to develop an international cultural exchange program. The position utilized her academic background and diplomatic experience, while keeping her far enough from Marcus's business interests to avoid conflicts of interest. Elena emerged from the elevator wearing a deep green dress that complemented her coloring beautifully. But it was the confidence in her posture, the genuine smile that lit her face when she saw him, that took Marcus's breath away. This was Elena as he had never seen her, successful, fulfilled, radiating the satisfaction that came from meaningful work. "Ready for your debut as a museum patron rather than just a donor?" she asked, linking her arm through his as they walked toward the entrance. "As long as you promise to explain anything I don't understand about pre-Columbian pottery," Marcus replied, earning a laugh that still had the power to make his chest tighten with affection. The past months had been a revelation for both of them. Without the structure of professional arrangement, they had discovered that the connection between them was not only real, but deeper than either had expected. They challenged each other intellectually, supported each other professionally, and had developed an intimacy that felt both surprising and inevitable. There had been difficult moments. Elena's adjustment to no longer needing to maintain professional boundaries, Marcus's learning to be vulnerable without feeling weak. But they had navigated each challenge together, building something neither had experienced before, a relationship based on genuine equality and mutual respect. As they entered the museum's great hall, now transformed for the evening celebration, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed since that first evening when he had expected to spend a few hours with hired companionship. Elena had been right about courage taking many forms. It had taken courage for her to walk away from corruption, courage to rebuild her career from an unconventional starting point, and courage to risk their professional arrangement for something uncertain but potentially transformative. For Marcus, courage had meant letting go of control, accepting uncertainty, and learning to value connection over conquest. Thank you so much for joining us on Marcus and Elena's journey. This story explores how our assumptions about strength, courage, and worth can blind us to the complexity of human experience. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you listening from, and what aspects of their story resonated with you? Your thoughts and perspectives from around the world help us understand how these universal themes of connection, transformation, and finding the courage to be vulnerable touch lives across different cultures and experiences.